Welcome to Lair of the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, I have some very special guests with me as we are going to be discussing doom metal, its history, as well as some of the most important and influential bands and albums from the genre. So let me introduce my special guests. Joining us from Pennsylvania is Brian Balich. Butch is the current singer in the doom metal bands Argus and Molasses Barge. He was also a member of the legendary doom band Penanace. Also joining us today from Virginia is Tom Phillips. Tom is the founder and guitar player for the epic doom metal band While Heaven Wept. Tom is also an A&R representative for Cruz del Sur Music, a record label specializing in traditional, epic, and doom metal. So thank you guys for joining me here at the Lair.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having
us. Now, doom metal is something that I know is close to all of our hearts here, and it's something I haven't talked a whole lot about on this channel, so I'm really excited for this episode. So guys, for those people out there who may not know what doom metal is, or maybe they've just heard the name, how would you describe the sound of doom metal, the unique characteristics of doom metal, things that are essential to the sound and whole package of doom? So Tom, why don't you get us started?
I'm going to sum it up in 2 words: Black Sabbath. I mean, it all really goes back to the sound that they created. And what I'm specifically referring to is like 1970 to, let's say, 1975, roughly, in the sense that it's this, there's a darkness, it's foreboding, it's way heavier than anything that had come before. The mood, I always equated doom with mood, right?
Yeah.
And so they're dealing with really heavy stuff, man, you know, and I was thinking about it today, actually, and I think a lot of it has to do with not only that the industrial town of Birmingham, right, and you know, still building back from World War II, they're finding themselves now again in the Vietnam War. It's like heaviness, like just, you know, cast over everything. And they're dealing with these horrors, and you know, it's all kind of permeating everything that they do, you know. So we're living in at that time, you know, in this Cold War as well, you know. We're on the brink of potential nuclear devastation. It's like you got to really set like this the picture up of like where it comes from, and they're channeling all that. They're escaping through horror movies and things like that, and they're kind of just blending all that together, and it becomes something that had never really happened before, you know. Like you had stuff like Zeppelin and Deep Purple, you know, and Hendrix and all that kind of stuff that set the precedent for like hard rock and all this, but there was still like this heavy folk aspect tied in and old blues. But Sabbath like just turned everything up like to 10, and it was a lot darker. The riffs, the vocals, everything about it just exuded a darkness that I don't think that we'd ever seen before. And considering this comes on the heels of like Summer of Love and all that kind of stuff, it's like this is like jaw-dropping stuff.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that really all roads in heavy metal in some ways lead to Black Sabbath, and especially with doom metal. So, and even though other people will bring up bands like Led Zeppelin or Uriah Heep, and they certainly had their heavy moments, Deep Purple, nobody had that mood, that sort of atmosphere, that heaviness, that foreboding, the doominess that even though they may not have been calling it that at that time, Black Sabbath just had the entire package: Ozzy's voice, the album covers, the song, the lyrics, the riffs, just everything. You know,
I
for
mean, I
me,
will throw one caveat though, and that is the year before the first Sabbath album was the first King Crimson album. And, you know, I know some people may disagree with me, but the fact of the matter is that if you read some of the early reviews of that record, that's actually the first mention of doom rock ever. And it's no doubt that if you think about that first Crimson album, there is really dark stuff on that. You know, you're talking about the same stuff: madness, despair, this darkness, and even when
it doesn't get much darker than Epitaph, man.
That's right. I mean, my opinion is that Epitaph is the first epic doom metal song of all time, but I have to throw it in there because I think a lot of people overlook it. They think about it as more of like a prog thing, but man, those riffs are heavy, man. 21st Century Schizoid, man. I mean, come on, that's heavier than Zeppelin and
yeah,
you know, Deep Purple at that time. So I think that factors in some way, because you have to understand is that you know, for their 13th concert, they played in front of 650,000 people in Hyde Park, England. So this is a massive audience. The exposure was massive. And there's no question that they made enough waves that even Sabbath and those guys would have heard. And I'm sure that it factors in some capacity. You know, I know it's a kind of a tangent, but for me, it's like those two albums, like that first Sabbath and the first Crimson, are kind of, you know, tied together in a lot of ways, because it gets into some dark stuff that really wasn't widespread before. You know, you would have like some occult type bands like Coven and then, you know, kind of contemporaries with Sabbath, Black Widow,
Yeah.
but it all just really still crystallizes with Sabbath. I mean, the imagery, everything about it, you know, that's the beginning for metal, period. And as we look back now and you think about these songs like Hand of Doom and Electric Funeral, I mean, it is, and Warning even, you know, which, you know, even if it's a cover, it's like the way they play it, it's like dark, you know, it's just foreboding. I mean, even the opening song, obviously, that's that. If someone asked me what is doom metal, I'd say go listen to the you know, the title track of Black Sabbath. You know, it's like from those tolling bells, that crushingly heavy riff. You know, that's the origin as we know it now. And when we look back, I think that's what all of us, you know, think of instantaneously. And that's, I was talking about Vitus actually for this book recently, and I use this connotation that, you know, if Sabbath is like the tree, then everything else that we're going to talk about, it's like it's a branch off from that ultimately.
Yeah. What about you, Butch? What is the sound of doom metal for you? How would you describe it?
Yeah, I mean, Tom actually covered a lot of that. I agree with most of that. I mean, to me, I mean, you're kind of, it depends on the audience you're talking to now. You know, with the way things have gotten and so split up into subgenres, you know, we're gonna, without getting into the endless arguments about what is doom and this and that. I mean, to me, it all goes back to that Sabbathy sound. You know, those huge riffs and that massive tone of Iommi and just the despair in Ozzy's voice, and you know, they're, you know, like we're saying, like lyrics about nuclear war and, you know, Vietnam. And I mean, it really was the you know, stake through the heart of, you know, peace and love at the time. There was nothing, I can't even imagine like what it would have been like to, I guess the closest comparison for someone around my age would be like what it was like when the thrash movement started. Like at that time, what's heavier than Sabbath? I mean, nothing overall. It's oppressive and dark and moody, and it just is so weighty that, so to me, like when I'm classifying doom, I mean, that's the heart of it for me too. So, and I
Yeah.
think for most of us that are, around the same age, that's it.
Yeah. I'm glad. I think, Tom, you said it's atmosphere and mood is a part of it, because for me it has to entail, it has to be sort of a whole package for me. I've got to have this slow, heavy riffs, the mood. It's got to conjure up a certain feeling towards me. Prepping for this, to get ready for this tonight, I went for a long walk this morning through a forest and listening to some music, and I thought, all right, this is putting me in the mood, because when I listen to doom metal, that's what it brings me to: forests, Gothic architecture, just that it just has a certain feeling and vibe to it. And I think what's confusing, or what's difficult for some people to figure out when it comes to doom, is I think on the surface, doom metal is close to traditional metal. And what I mean by that is that you've got the clean vocals, you've got there's an element of just regular metal inside doom metal. It's pretty easy if you sit somebody down and say, okay, here's a Ozzy song and here's a Cannibal Corpse song. They're able to hear right away, like, whoa, these two things are really different here because of the different vocals and death metal. But doom metal is, to me, a close partner to, it crosses over with regular metal. There's that element. So there's times where you could say, well, hey, the song Diary of a Madman, that's a very doomy song. Let's look at that album, the song Diary of a Madman, the song Believer. There's doomy song, but is that a doom metal album? I wouldn't say so, because it doesn't have enough. That's only a small part of that particular album.
Right.
You need to have a certain quotient of this sort of heavy, this doomy, this atmosphere has to be, because, again, there's a lot of, Neil Young has some songs that are pretty dark and doomy, you know what I mean? That doesn't make him a doom metal, artist. So you just sort of need the entire package. And for me, what really sets it off for me is it has to conjure a certain feeling and mood and emotion. And in some ways, I almost feel, sometimes I say this to people and they're, because it sounds crazy at first, but hear me out. Doom metal in some ways is similar to me as black metal, because even though they're both polar opposite with the way they get to that point, doom metal slow, heavy, black metal fast, and to me, they're both two subgenres that rely heavily on atmosphere and sort of putting you in a certain mood and a certain mindset.
And sincerity. Look, I mean, like the best black metal is the stuff where those are the guys that actually believe what they're singing about, and that's my opinion. And I think that the best doom metal comes from people that really feel those emotions that you hear in that music. And this gets into the whole thing of where do I draw the line, and for me, it's like, if when I hear something that resonates to my core, then I know it's legit. You know what I mean? And otherwise, I don't think it's crazy at all what you're saying. It's like it perfectly makes sense to me. Even beyond what you're saying, actually. It's like there's some stuff that you listen to and you just know the instant that you hear it that's legit. You know what I mean? There's no mistaking that that these guys are really like feeling this and thinking this. And then you have these other bands that are like, oh, this is cool, let's just do this, because it's different from thrash or something like that. But I think that factors in, man. It really does.
And doom metal is a style that relies so much on emotion that it's, in a way, it's hard to fake it. You really got it. It's got to be sincere, or it's easy to tell when it's not sincere, because on top of the mood and the atmosphere, there is that certain element of, you need emotion, in there to make it be good and real. So all right, we talked. Go ahead, Butch. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, I think it's one of those things, like, when they talk about some of the musicians, I'm just a singer and I don't play, but you read things about guys like Eddie Van Halen, or any like guitarist that has a special sound to it. And the one thing I see a lot of times when they talk about the way that guy sounds is like, it doesn't matter what equipment they're playing on. It's like they embody the sound by the way that they play. So I think doom is the same thing. You either, like, it's real easy to tell when someone's just, like Tom was saying, just kind of like pick, oh, this is cool right now, or when someone's really feeling it. I don't think you can fake emotion that well. So that's all I had to say about that.
Yeah, no.
Sometimes bands try, though, you know, but that's where we get into like some territory that I think is best left for later on. But look, you know, just might as well just like address something straight out of the gate here, and you'll often see doom metal and stoner rock being thrown in under the same umbrella, and that's right there. What we're talking about is one of the big differences right there. It's like, look, there's no question that it all comes from Sabbath, okay? But when you're singing about vans and surfing and smoking weed and this kind of stuff, look, that's a whole different story from Apocalypse, you know what I'm saying? And so that's one of the big things that separates it, you know? It's like, and for me, they are separate things in all actuality, you know?
Yeah. And it's amazing how Black Sabbath, again, you can go back through Black Sabbath and you could say, you know, Darren, and people on the show here know Darren. He's been on the show a bunch of times. We have a Black Sabbath podcast that we do, and we just did a episode on Master of Reality, and we were talking about how you can pick out certain songs in Black Sabbath and go, okay, this is the birth of stoner rock. You know, here's the birth of doom metal. Here's the birth of traditional metal. You know, Sabbath was just this band, like you said, they're sort of the roots, the foundation, the base of the tree that all the branches, you know, kind of go off from them.
Right.
So, all right, we talked about Black Sabbath. Are there any other bands from the 70s that you think may have had an influence on the creation of doom metal to come in the 80s? Because really at this point in the 70s, the word doom is getting mentioned every now and then. Like, I don't know if you guys can see, if I can point out the right way, that Jerusalem album I have up there that was produced by Ian Gillan. Yeah, in his liner notes for that record, he calls it doomy. I forget exactly how he says it, but he uses the word doom in it. But really at the time in the 70s, you know, no one was really using that expression. It hadn't become a subgenre yet. But are there any other bands from the 70s? You mentioned King Crimson earlier, Tom. Are there any other bands from the 70s that we think are important in sort of the creation of doom metal?
Well, certainly Pentagram, you know, that kind of goes without saying. It's like, I know a lot of people weren't aware of their existence until some of the reissues in the 90s. But growing up where I did, I mean, they're like the local heroes kind of, or something like that. So, we were very much plugged in and aware of what they were doing, and it was just as heavy, and just as dark and sinister. And I think that for everyone that was plugged in down the line, you know, they were aware of Pentagram, and certainly this may factor in a little bit more so in the early 80s, because of the Dutch East India deal, and getting those records out at that time. But, you know, they had those 45s out before that. I mean, there was actually a push, you know, to sign Pentagram to Casablanca and all this kind of stuff. Of course, everyone knows this story, or maybe they don't, you know, but
yeah,
you know, that Kiss ended up coming down, and they ended up signing Angel instead, you know. But yeah, I mean, Pentagram definitely factors in a big way. Like, if you talk to like other guys from our pedigree, we were certainly aware of them. You know, and look, there's some dark and weird bands from the 70s that factor in for those that were like crate diggers of LPs, right? You know, you had bands like Necronomicon in Germany and Museo Rosenbach in Italy that were doing these dark, heavy things. I mean, that Necronomicon, it's like the album is like tips for committing suicide, you know. It's like this is dark stuff, you know. So but whether or not it actually is doom metal, that's debatable, you know. But these are all building blocks, and you know, and I think we'd be remiss if we dismiss Judas Priest, because after Sabbath, you know, there's really the first band that I think most people know that identify themselves as a heavy metal band, right?
Yes.
Not even Sabbath did that, right?
Yeah.
But if you consider things like Sad Wings of Destiny and Sin After Sin, there's some pretty doomy stuff on those too, you know, and it makes sense. They drank the same water as the Sabbath guys, you know.
Yeah.
Birmingham stuff too, so it's in there.
Yeah, I mean, Here Come the Tears. I mean, it doesn't get much doomier than that. Beyond the Realms of Death.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that sums it up. It's in there, but it's peppered in there, you know. I think at this point, you know, when you talk about the 70s, and even when you talk about, you know, I did a thing about epic metal for Death Forever recently, this magazine in Germany, and I think what I realized is that, you know, a lot of these bands would have kind of a doomy song on the record, right? You know, if you dig through and listen to most heavy bands that came after Sabbath, there would be like these heavier, more emotional songs, but it wouldn't define the entire album, you know. But there's certainly like these standout tracks that come into play, and I think that as we get towards the end of the 70s and the early 80s, that's where you see these cats coming out saying, hey, that's the stuff that I dig, you know, or whatever. And then why don't we elaborate upon this? I mean, that's not entirely the reason why it all happened from there. I mean, I think we're moving on to the 80s, it seems like, but what I'm throwing out here is that you got to think about the climate of the end of the 70s, right? We get into this new wave territory, punk rock, like all the prog stuff that got big was being dismissed as dinosaur rock and all this kind, and overblown, out of touch, right? So you had this whole punk thing that happens, and bands are getting further and further away from that original sound of Sabbath and Priest and stuff like that, until we have the new wave of British heavy metal, right? And that's where I think probably the next relevant thing factors in, right? And that's some Witchfinder General, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right.
Got anything to add to the 70s, Butch?
Well, I just think, I mean, I've had this conversation with people before. There's a whole lot of stuff that in retrospect is like Tom was saying about crate digging. I mean, there's a whole lot of bands that you find out about, like some of your, you know, the library here at Pitt had a copy of the International Encyclopedia of Heavy Metal. And I don't know how many bands I discovered that way, but like take a band like Bang, or, you know, these bands that had like huge, like Sabbathy kind of riffs. And I mean, look at Budgie, like heavy beyond belief. But a lot of the bands like didn't have, like, it really isn't until later that their effect is kind of felt. Like none of them had an immediate effect the way that Sabbath did. I mean, and certainly, like, sometimes I think it's easy to look past the obvious in front of us. Like, you know, when you talk about metal, you know, if you want to seem, sometimes some people, you know, in an effort to seem like they dig a little deeper, you know, you're looking past Sabbath to all these other bands. I mean, and bands like Bang and Surler, Baltimore, or Budgie are great bands, but I mean, how many of them ever really like were as heavy and important as Sabbath? I mean, the 70s had, you know, maybe Blue Oyster Cult, I think, would have been important in a lot of ways to Doom, especially if you talk to, just because of their lyrical topics and things, and they were weird, and but certainly sonically not near as heavy. But I think that's another band that was important to the development of it in some ways.
I'll agree with that. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Viewers of the channel know that I have a program, series that I do called Heavy Hidden Gems. And we talk a lot about, we've talked about Sir Lord Baltimore and Captain Beyond. And I totally agree with you guys where these albums tend to have a couple really heavy songs, but then there's some stuff that's not. And it's really, for me, Black Sabbath, like we've all said here, was the band that sort of put it all together, the whole entire package from top to bottom. I mean, who is playing as heavy as Under the Sun, for instance, back then? The other thing I would say though is maybe there's also, if you take Rainbow, like Ronnie James Dio and Stargazer, that epic quality to some of that Dio era Rainbow stuff. That might be something too that I think influenced Doom a little bit later on. Ronnie James Dio, of course, he goes on to join Black Sabbath, but Ronnie, he was really, for back then, of course, there were a lot of great singers back then, but he had a certain, epic quality to him. And he was different than Ozzy. Ozzy had that tone and atmosphere to his voice that gave it that creepy nature. To me, Dio had that epic quality to his voice. Gates of Babylon, Stargazer, power, epic feel. So if you sort of take that element of Stargazer and that epic bombastic nature and tie it in with the Sabbath, the slow doomy Sabbath stuff, to me that's when the cauldron's starting to bubble here and Doom is starting to it's starting to form.
Well, that definitely factors in, like when you get to Solitute Aetrunus and While Heaven Wept, but we're not there yet. So.
All right, so let's move on. I will say one other thing to the viewers out there. We talked about Pentagram. Pentagram was a band that, for those who may not know them, they were a band that was around in the 70s. They, like Tom mentioned, released a couple 7 inches and stuff. They didn't really release a proper full-length album until the 80s, but all their stuff from the 70s would be later on put together on compilations and re-released. So, and there was a movie out called Last Days Here that, for those who might be interested, you should check out that movie because it sort of tells the Pentagram story. So, all right. So you mentioned the new wave of British heavy metal. Here we are now at the late 70s. Things are getting heavier. Judas Priest, we talked about Priest, we mentioned Rainbow, Scorpions are pretty heavy at this time. Things are getting heavier. The new wave of British heavy metal is starting. Where is doom metal in that sort of late 70s, early 80s time frame there?
Well, there's a handful of bands that started to reach back to the Sabbath kind of vibe, and I think that's sort of important to consider, because there wasn't a whole lot of that at the time. I think what the whole thing with new wave of British heavy metal, which at the time it wasn't even called that, just for the record, because this is when I started collecting records, is when these things were coming out, and up to this point everything is just called heavy metal. Let's be clear about that. But what you end up have happening is you get these people that are into like prog and the Purple Sabbath, Uriah Heep, and this kind of stuff, but also the speed and the energy of punk, and you're fusing that together, and that ultimately yields a lot of this new wave of British heavy metal stuff as we call it today. And so most of those bands were pushing the speed a little bit. They're you got these more punky elements. You when you listen to Venom or something like that, there's an aspect of that in there, even though it doesn't sound like the Sex Pistols or the Ramones or something like that, but there's this garagey rawness, the speed, and this kind of stuff happening. And even bands like Maiden and so forth, it's like it's in there. Paul Di'Anno would always brought that component to the table, for example, with Maiden. And I think a lot of those bands, they're bringing that stuff in. They're bringing in Thin Lizzy, Wishbone Ash, and all that kind of stuff, and modernizing it a little bit. But there were these handful of bands like Witchfinder General, for example, that stood out because this doesn't sound like that. This sounds like Sabbath type stuff. It's as heavy as Sabbath. It's similar kind of occult imagery, you know, and just similar topics, and it's heavy as hell. You know, it's compared to Praying Mantis and Saxon and other bands that are coming out at this time. Something like Witchfinder General certainly is a whole other ball game. And I mention them specifically because we were able to get their albums here in the States, right? It's easy to look back now and talk about Pagan Altar and Tellurian and and Hell and all these other bands, but honestly no one ever heard of those bands outside of their scenes locally in England until much later. But Witchfinder General definitely factored in, at least for me. I mean, I was in high school, we were jamming Death Penalty and having a good old time, to say the least, with that stuff, so for me, that's probably the next example in this doom metal tree, right, where we're building upwards, and that those first branches are starting to pop out, and that's definitely one of them.
Yeah, what do you think, Butch?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, Witchfinder General obviously is a huge example of that kind of thing, and I'd probably throw I never saw it as doomy or blatant, but it's definitely darker. It would be that first Angel Witch album, and those two bands in the new wave of British heavy metal, I mean, definitely started taking things more in a Sabbathy direct, definitely going in like a direction a little bit different than, like Tom was saying, like Maiden and Saxon and these other bands are going. There's some bands that you can't apply it to the whole album, like Quartz has a couple of like really doomy songs, like Stoking Up the Fires of Hell and Satan's Serenade, and but it didn't carry for a whole album. Like, you get some rock and roll stuff in there too, but I think those, the Witchfinder General and Angel Witch for sure, of that era, important.
Yeah, and I think Witchfinder General might be, are they the first band to really be looking back at Black Sabbath and saying like, okay, I mean, there were bands, of course, that were influenced by Black Sabbath, but Witchfinder General feels to me like the first band that really went, okay, we're going to take this element of Black Sabbath and just make our whole thing is going to be that, the atmosphere, the slowness, the heaviness, the whole vibe. I don't really know. Like you mentioned, Butch, there were bands, of course, that had heavy songs here and there, but it seemed like Witchfinder General was a real conscious, okay, we're going to do Black Sabbath here. This is going to be our main influence, and we're going to really hone in on that particular that sound from Black Sabbath. That's the slower, the heavier stuff, the mood and everything.
Yeah, they really had the closest to the riffs were like the closest thing to that. And then you got Z Parks. Those vocals are like super close to what Ozzy was doing. Raw and untrained, and just they just like you said. I mean, it's very much a modern. Sabbath was still around at the time, obviously, but it was like for that period, like it was the most Sabbath-like band, and still for that, for one of the most Sabbath-like bands of the genre, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will say this, that they definitely had some faster songs too, just like Angel Witch, and again, I think that everybody at that time is aware of this punk movement that had gone on. I think that does factor in. So yeah, it's like if you took 70s Sabbath and modernized it a little bit to that time, that's the end result of that. And it's interesting that I keep bringing up punk related stuff, because the next thing I think about is like what's happening over here. And I think about Black Flag, right? Because they become important in the equation ultimately, not inherently because that they were a doom band by any means, but there's this transition that happens, and this ultimately leads to things that are happening here, with Saint Vitus, for example, right? It's like there's that raw garagey aspect, all of a sudden Black Flag drops some real crazy Sabbathy type stuff at some point into their career, and and Vitus is very much plugged into this because they're label mates, they're sharing stages, and I think that's where some of the garagey and punky aspects come from, but yeah, look, the next big development is without a question Saint Vitus,
Yeah.
That's really like ground zero, I think, for a lot of folks, is Vitus, because that stuff got out a lot more than Witchfinder General ever did, to the masses,
Right. Yeah. So let's move on. So we had Witchfinder General in sort of the early 80s as a part of the new wave of British heavy metal. So then, like Tom mentioned, we had the first Saint Vitus album, which came out in 84. The first Trouble album comes out in 84, and the first Pentagram album comes out in 85. So really, I think like you mentioned, let's talk about those bands, because I think, like you mentioned, it's starting to now really crystallize, if you will.
Yeah, that's it's all the same branch, right? With Witchfinder General and this kind of thing, and then you have Vitus, Trouble, Pentagram, all sounding very much Sabbath influenced. There's no mistaking that, and it's even heavier in some ways. Same kind of mood and topics, and these are examples where Trouble to a little bit lesser extent, because they had some faster songs, you know what I mean? But when they went doomy, it was extremely doomy,
Yeah.
and it's really more like, for me, when I think of Trouble, it's more about the skull, right? That's where it's like, this is unmistakably doom,
That's the one.
but yeah, look, that's all of those bands at this time. This is a very intentional, look back at the Sabbath, origins, bringing it up to the, the 80s. And for the most part, those albums are pretty solid in that direction. There's not very much in the way of deviation into like some folky jam or some kind of like, when we talk about these bands like Angel Witch or Quartz, or it's like you would have like those doomy songs and stuff like that, but then you have all these songs that are not really doomy. Same thing with Bloister Cult and all that kind of stuff, Priest. But like these albums, the large bulk of the album is pretty much this slower, heavy, crushing riffage. It's like, for me, it's hard to separate those bands out from each other, because it's all kind of happening at the same time.
Yeah. What do you think, Butch?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's it was it's so interesting to me that looking back at it, that these are bands that I first heard of them, flipping through metal magazines, really, or seeing record covers and like wondering what this is all about. And then when you finally hear them, like, it's interesting that a band like Trouble really was going, so much against the grain in a way of what was, thrash was starting to ramp up, things were getting faster, and here's a band that's, although they did have faster songs, which I think is something that the honestly the best bands in the genre have known, is that you don't, like, Sabbath never kept it to one tempo. They like fluctuated them and had changes, and a band like Trouble did the same thing. But for them to like go back to doing slower stuff when everything else was speeding up is just, but it's so incredibly heavy, and the skull from top to bottom. I mean, the bookends of that record with Pray for the Dead and the skull. I mean, I don't think it gets any doomier than that. Like that to me is that's my album from the time period. As far as like the 3 or 4 Godfathers of the 80s go, they probably like inch it out at the top for me. But yeah.
I'm gonna have to agree with that, man. I mean, it's all about the skull for me because, I think at the time you have to consider that those guys were not necessarily at their healthiest, and I think that some of the things that they were dabbling with actually impacted it in the same way that similar extracurricular activities imparted like this aspect with Sabbath, Master Reality, Volume 4, and all that kind of stuff. So the kinds of drug abuse and stuff that's going on, it's like it factors in. It does, it's no secret. And it's interesting thinking about this time, 1984, 85. You're right, because thrash is starting to ramp up. These are the same years that we see things like Metallica, Ride the Lightning, Haunting the Chapel from Slayer, and all this kind of stuff. And that's, for all intents and purposes, that's the new thing. And you see more and more of these bands coming out of the Bay Area, and also New York as well, that it's all about speed, right? And yet there are these bands, these holdouts that are on the same record labels, Metal Blade Records and stuff like that, that are going backwards, going back to that time of Sabbath and even Priest and all that kind of stuff. And I think that they were plugged in some ways, because there's a heaviness there that was lacking in thrash, right? It was fast, right? There was this energy, and obviously it's like, an evolution, new wave British heavy metal and hardcore, speed, all that stuff kind of put together with, there's no escaping Sabbath. Sabbath is just as influential on all of those bands. But here's the thing, the faster things get, the less heavy it is. And that was always evident to me. So it's like when you hear something like, Bastards Will Pay, and you put that up against Seek and Destroy, it's like, there's no question that, like, the Trouble stuff, it's like way heavier, no doubt.
Yeah, what I always found interesting about those 3 bands is they always represented a slightly different, you had Saint Vitus, which was on SST Records, which was a punk label. So Saint Vitus had a little bit of a garagey, more of a lo-fi, if you want to say punkish in the way they went about doing business, let's say it that way. You had Trouble, which for me had some of those faster songs, which put them, there was a little bit of that traditional metal influence in their sound. And then you had, who's the third band that we were talking about? From Pentagram, right, which were really like Sabbath, slow, down-tuned Sabbath worshiping. And, and it should be mentioned too, for those out there that aren't familiar with Doom, for some people, when they hear Doom, the first thing that pops into their mind is like slow, droning stuff. And although, of course, slow and heavy is a big part of the Doom sound, it is Doom metal. And I remember once talking to Leif from Candlemass, and he said that to me. He said, Candlemass is not a Doom band. We are a Doom metal band. Because he talked about how Angel Witch and all that kind of stuff was as integral part of their sound. Sabbath, of course, but there is also a metal element that I think runs through all these bands like Trouble and Pentagram and everything.
Yeah, I mean, look, without getting ahead of ourselves, I can tell you, like, when the debates really start happening later on, the bottom line is this, is that there have to be discernible riffs, okay, and clear vocals, right, that impart the emotion and make it very clear like where this is coming from. So that's, I think that one of the big factors that is that you have these very obvious pummeling, crushing riffs, you know, woven together with like these atmospheres of despair of any kind. You know, I think that for a lot of these bands, you know, drugs factor in heavily, you know, but more in a negative way than say some other bands where they may glorify it. You know, this is more about like the horrors of it, right? And so that definitely like is a component for a lot of doom bands, you know. And I think that is another one of these things with stoner rock where, you know, yeah, people may lump it in together because of that, you know, and because of that Sabbath lineage and then the drug use. But the thing is that if you listen to most of the bands that delve into this kind of, you know, area, this topic, you know, it's like, it's not encouraging you to go out and smoke a bowl and like, you know, drive down the road to pick up chicks or something like that. This is more like the kind of stuff where you're like shriveling up in the corner,
Yeah.
you know, fiending for like your next hit, you know, or whatever. So, you know, it does all kind of like get little interrelated in some ways, you know, and there's certainly commonalities between all those bands, but really I think at this point no one is actually referring to them as doom metal, right? We're still looking back and citing them as influences here, or the pillars and the foundations, but I think that the calling card in all those cases is people would use Sabbath as the reference, right? It's like Sabbathian metal or whatever,
Yeah.
right? No one ever was actually saying that that's doom metal, right? That's still like another year away before we start getting into that, you know?
Yeah. So
Yeah, here it
leads us
comes.
up to 1986. And this drops Candlemass, Epicus, Doomicus, Metallicus.
That's
So
right.
this is a pretty pivotal, important album, I think, on the doom metal tree. So let's, Butch, why don't you start us off here with your thoughts on Epicus, Doomicus?
Well, oddly enough, well, not oddly enough, but honestly, my history with Candlemass doesn't start with that record. It starts with Nightfall, which I picked up. We got it on a whim, man. You remember those days? You go to the record store and go to the listening booth in Lehigh Valley and flip through the records, and like, oh, this cover looks cool. You flip it over, and all this. You think this is metal? This is metal. Yeah, let's get it. So, you know, we bought Nightfall first, and then after like becoming a fan of that record, went backwards. But to me, like, it's like an A/B thing, you know, which one did you hear first? You know, so for me, Nightfall's always been the most important Candlemass record. Although I love Epicus. You know, I mean, you can't deny Solitude. You can't deny the songs on the record, you know, Black Stone Wielder, but like I said, it's hard for me to talk about this one as being like the major influence on me because it was the next one that was bigger. But I worship this record. It's one of my favorite Candlemass records. And if it wasn't From the 13th Sun, and that's getting into something else, it'd be like my number 2 Candlemass album. So
yeah. What do you think, Tom, about Epicus, Doomicus, Metallicus?
Well, it's kind of interesting because my relationship with Candlemass actually begins with the Samaritan 12-inch, right? And then hearing At the Gallows End on a Metal Blade compilation, and I can tell you, like, that along with some Fate's Warning, that those instances, that leads directly to While Heaven Wept a couple years down the road here. But yeah, that's what I heard first. And you got to remember, like, this Black Dragon records and stuff like this, I mean, that's a little bit harder to find than Metal Blade at this time, right? You know, you're talking about like 86, 87. It's like not as available, right? It's not like now where you could just go online to Discogs or something and find basically anything that you want, or there's no eBay or anything like that. You actually had to go dig for these things. So that they didn't necessarily, New Renaissance, they didn't have the same distribution, right? And unless you had like a Tower Records that was like really plugged in, or some mom and pop shop, I mean, you weren't going to find it like at you know, Waxy Maxy's necessarily. I mean, they would have an import section, but it was small, you know. So yeah, so I came into Candlemass a little bit later myself, and then went back. You know, it wasn't that long though. You know, I've tracked it down because I was like, this is crazy. Because again, you have to remember that at this point, 86, 87, now it's like thrash is really like boiling, right? And that's where I was growing up. That's what I was growing up with. And to hear something that was 100% doom, it was like, whoa, this is really crazy. And plus those insane operatic vocals, it's like,
Yes.
this is different from anything else that was happening, you know. And when all is said and done, you know, you talk about life altering moments. It's like hearing At the Gallows End, it was like, and the way that Messiah sang that, for me, it's like you really felt the despair in the same way that you would listening to that, you know, the eponymous Black Sabbath track. You know, it's like that's the same kind of like horror and despair. You know, this guy is about to be hung. You know, it's like really intense stuff, and that set the precedent for me. You know, I mean, obviously, like it set a lot of things in motion, because you know, we come along not too long after that. But the thing is that going back to Epicus, right? It's like, wait, man, this ain't the same singer. What the hell's going on here? Yeah. You know, but I actually loved it even more. And for me, Epicus is without a question my favorite Candlemass album, because there are things happening on there that are so emotionally intense, even more so than At the Gallows End, right? And I think it has a lot to do with Johann singing. He's very expressive, and it's crazy that he at the time was basically, you know, a fill-in, you know, or like a hired gun type of guy, you know. But he sang those songs like he meant them, man. And you know, yeah, I know you saw, like when you said Blackstone Wielder, I mean, like that's like everyone talks about Solitude and Demon's Gate, Sorcerer's Pledge, man, but for me, it's all about Blackstone Wielder. That's my jam, you know.
So is really this is Epicus, Doomicus, Metallicus? Is this really where now the term doom metal starts becoming a conscious thing, that from here on out now do you know, it becomes a subgenre? Is this that point?
It's definitely the establishment, and in addition to that, that's also the second branch off that Sabbath tree. Okay, that's where we start seeing like a different take on the Sabbath sound, right?
Yeah.
Because, like you said, you know, Life's bringing in like some Angel Witch and some of these other things that he's listening to. That all kind of feeds in together, and that establishes a completely different thing. But you could still trace it back. It's still got the same kind of riffing. It's the slowness, the heaviness, the darkness, the emotion. It's all there. And so it's just that it's got more of a European sound, right? It's not based in the blues. It's got more of like this neoclassical element.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was going to say earlier. It's like, look, you know, if people want to know what doom metal is, just take like an Yngwie Malmsteen record and play it at 33 instead of 45. You know what I mean? It's like just slow all that stuff down, and that's Candlemass. You know, that's what it sounded like to me, because the guitar playing was phenomenal. And it really had that European kind of sound that I craved anyway. So yeah, look, that's the beginning in terms. That's the first time I think that anyone's ever put it out there that it was doom metal. plain and simple in any capacity. And it's only after that that we see bands being referred to as or calling themselves doom metal. It's after that.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that. That's around the time when, after Candlemass and after Nightfall came out and was, relatively successful in the States. I'd say that's when you definitely started hearing the term thrown around, and we've retroactively applied it to a whole bunch of stuff. But I mean, this is the time period where the term itself started getting thrown around.
And if I recall correctly, I mean, I think 86 or whatever, Revelation, that's probably one of the first bands to actually, look, you think about Salvation's Answer, the album comes out a few years later, 91, but I mean, it literally says doom metal on the cover, you know what I'm saying? So like as we curve into the 90s, that's where it really happens. But look, Revelation was there in 86, and not too long after that you get Solitute Aetrunus, who are unabashedly, like, it's a doom thing. They admitted it. John Perez talked about it, because there's a lot of these guys coming out of these thrash bands, and they're realizing things like, this is getting kind of boring, the speed for the sake of speed, and it's actually heavier to play things slower. Even Slayer, come 1988, right? You get South of Heaven, it's like after Rain and Blood, and I think a lot of people miss the point. It's like, once you've reached a certain level, there's no Rain and Blood 2, okay? It's like, you got to do something completely different and open things back up. And I think that's where you have a lot of guys coming from, like these underground, extreme, at the time, metal musicians, realizing that they're losing the heaviness. Let's bring it back with like the Sabbath. That's really what it kind of comes down to.
Yeah, and I would say too that this is Candlemass is where too the epic element starts to come into play, where with the album covers, Nightfall and Ancient Dreams, there's just really just epic quality that gets brought into the doom metal sound. So
that's probably where the when you were talking about Rainbow earlier, that's where we actually hear it. We hear it more on that side of the fence than anything else. You don't hear that in St. Vitus, Trouble, or Pentagram, but you definitely hear the Dio stuff, within the framework of Candlemass.
Yeah,
for sure.